Hello. We have seen how the need for energy can only grow in the context of a capitalism whose aim is to constantly increase profits. In terms of energy, this perspective is reflected by the fact that only 27.6% of the world's energy consumption is for personal use, while more than two-thirds is in effect used to ensure the continuation of a society based on such a perspective, production, maintenance of the necessary infrastructure, etc. This discrepancy between the two numbers also implies that energy production is not in the hands of the people, but in the hands of the capitalist system for its own interests, and that human beings are subject to this system and therefore are not free, since they do not generate their own energy needs and therefore cannot be in control of their lives, their activities, and their labor. Decentralizing energy production could lead to individual production, which would involve far fewer monetary transactions, namely far less contribution to capital. In other words, energy production and the control of that production can only become increasingly centralized. This centralization goes hand in hand with the concentration that necessarily follows from the race for profits, where big capital can only oust smaller capital. This can be seen from the very beginning of the era of capitalism that can be described as financial, namely the second half of the 19th century. Moreover, as long as centralization remained impossible, this type of capitalism could not be achieved. In 1881, Thomas Edison successfully lighted an entire group of houses. His system operated on direct current and required multiple generating stations located near habitations. Physicist Nikola Tesla, working for industrialist Westinghouse, devised a different one based on alternating current, namely one in which, contrary to the former, the flow continuously changes direction. It enables central power stations to deliver electric current over long distances. The former entails decentralization and local control, the latter centralization. Industrial and political centralization aiding and aided by financial centralization. Expectedly, AC carried the day despite its weak points. Both types of currents meet with a certain amount of power loss. The second law of thermodynamics tells us it cannot be otherwise. But the loss is evidently far greater in large networks. Moreover, the electromotive force necessary to push the current, namely the voltage, has to be high when distances are long. In fact, DC would have been the reasonable choice. Its principal drawback, namely its appropriateness for densely populated areas, but not for isolated homes, the reverse being the case with AC, could have been resolved by renewable energy sources better adapted to sparsely inhabited zones. The main argument given to justify the choice of AC was a logically flawed circular one, that transformers require AC. In the first place, they are devices needed for high voltage lines associated to AC, At one end to boost the voltage, and at the other to once again reduce it to make it amenable for usage. So we ended up with a doubly incompatible system, since batteries continue to operate on direct current. With renewable energies, the same trend towards centralization is unfolding, with plans for large-scale wind and solar farms. Both Edison and Westinghouse had practical goals and were motivated by profit, but with one crucial difference. In the Edisonian model, managerial leadership provides scientific leadership through a familiarity with and personal involvement in the scientific and technological work in progress, keeping in close touch with each researcher. In the Westinghouse model, there is little to no connection between research and management, research being subservient to the latter. It is this model of capitalism that has endured. Its victory over Edison's can be seen as a parallel to the victory of alternating current over direct current, or rather, this battle over the method of transporting electricity is what enabled the triumph of financial capitalism. But is this model viable? Once all that matters is the growth of profit, in order to maintain itself, such a doctrine must increasingly exploit the environment as well as human beings, namely extract as much work as possible with the minimum of investment. And so this exploitation necessarily needs to expand and take over new areas. This capitalism, born in Protestant Europe and especially England, imposed or taken over by the West as a whole, first exploited its own environment and then its native population, but at the same time it rapidly extended to the exploitation of the entire planet and all its inhabitants. The latter made it for a while possible to ensure Western populations would not rebel by giving them crumbs of the profit generated by colonialism. Once the planet was under exploitation, it became necessary to increase the efficiency of this population. First, in the colonies or the third world after their independence, which was more legal than anything else, and then of its own populations. And so, to continue protect from any possibility of rebellion, methods had to be put in place to control them more and more. At the same time, as the exploitation of the physical world reached its limits, to allow profits to grow, it became necessary to move into the virtual sphere, that of the internet, which can be reduced to zeros and ones, and therefore beyond physical reality, both living and inert, that of electronics, or more simply, electricity. This reflects the context of a financial capitalism devoted to money, namely to a means of exchange, and therefore to a concept that is to some extent immaterial as a goal, rather than the production of physical things. For several decades now, the greatest fortunes have been based on the development or mere replication of computer programs. Money itself is becoming more and more immaterial zeros and ones because there aren't enough equivalent material goods. And the logic of profit is leading to attempts to transform physical reality, including living things, into zeros and ones, into computer simulations by means of digital twins of the Earth, namely digital representations of the Earth system spanning scales and domains, as stated in an article published in Nature in 2024. But we are flesh and blood beings, so virtual wealth, being immaterial, must be converted into real wealth. Regular conversions cause worsening crisis, since there is no longer sufficient material goods to sustain wealth, thereby worsening its pauperization, since money, as we have mentioned, is becoming increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So people have to be forced to accept, which requires ever greater control. And so these zeros and ones are also used to operate all the infrastructure needed for such control: 5G, 6G, surveillance cameras, etc. And we are therefore entering an era of increasingly widespread surveillance. All this requires energy, because all work requires energy. So let us see what the situation looks like. World electricity consumption was around 27,000 terawatt hours in 2023, and production around 29,100 terawatt hours, an increase of 2.6% compared to 2022. Assuming a similar increase per year by 2030, electricity production should reach 34,800 terawatt hours. Production is 6 to 8% higher than consumption due to losses in transmission and distribution. Consumption should therefore be around 32,000 to 33,000 terawatt hours. In fact, it is estimated that it will reach 31 to 36,000 terawatt hours in 2030. To reach 36,000, production would need to be in the region of 38 to 39 terawatt hours. Let us now estimate the amount of energy needed for the digitalization and surveillance project. For this, we need the Internet of Things, IoT. Some predict that the network itself could consume 5 million terawatt hours in 2030 if technologies remain similar to what they were in 2019. For others, IoT electricity consumption is expected to decrease significantly with the development of smaller transistors, lower power consumption devices, and faster wireless data communication technologies to just under 1 terawatt hour. This is supposedly the reason for the IoT craze. But as we have seen, the notion that action making life digital can be accomplished without energy constraints is fanciful, to say the least. If we assume that the amount of electrical energy consumed by the IoT is negligible, then that means that its consumption is increasing elsewhere indirectly. IoT and surveillance need chips, namely semiconductors. The more energy efficient we want them to be, the more energy their manufacture consumes. The primary energy consumption for their manufacture is estimated to be 9,722 terawatt-hour in 2025. The compound annual growth rate between 2025 and 2030 is estimated to be 7.5%, and so this consumption should reach 13,958 terawatt-hour in 2030. 83% of this total energy consumed is estimated to be electric. In other words, 11,585 terawatt hours. It is estimated that 83% of semiconductor production is used for digitalization, which translates into electricity consumption of about 9,615 terawatt hours. Computers, 47%, consumer electronics, 23%, communications equipment, 13%. To this, let us add the electrical energy needed for information and telecommunication technologies, estimated to reach 10 to 20% of overall electricity consumption in 2030, namely 3,100 to 7,200 terawatt hours. We reach 12,715 to 16,815 terawatt hours. This estimate does not take into account many factors, including energy-intensive devices such as surveillance cameras and electric vehicles, which are generally excluded from the IoT estimates of less than 1 terawatt hour. Furthermore, based on International Energy Agency IEA figures, electricity consumption by industries other than the semiconductor industry can be estimated to be at least 30% of total electricity consumption, that is between 9,300 and 10,800 terawatt hours. In total, this represents at least 70 to 75% of total electricity consumption, which leaves no room for individual electricity consumption. Whether we take the scenario that shows that the consumption of digitalization will be astronomical, or the one that reduces that of the IoT to less than 1 terawatt hour, overall electricity consumption could well be much higher than forecast in 2030, or even impossible to achieve. In any case, without increasing the production of fossil fuels, it is difficult to see how these levels can be reached, especially as the efficiency of electricity production is reaching its limits. Although 60% of the energy used to produce electricity is lost, it seems illusory to think of reducing this loss given the laws of thermodynamics. So even if we manage to vary energy sources and increase the efficiency of energy production and its conversion into work, the digitalization project is unrealistic, and the project of surveillance based on digitalization even less so. In fact, even if we restrict individual energy consumption more and more, and for this end increase prices, these projects remain unrealistic. We need to reduce the world's population, a recurrent theme in the official discourse. But the more precarious living conditions become, the greater need for control to prevent any rebellion, and so the energy required for the project will constantly have to increase. Dematerialization by no means implies that everything is possible. On the contrary, it consumes a great deal of energy in one way or another. Internet and telecommunications are human inventions and therefore part of physical reality, and therefore subject to the laws of that reality, which cannot be transgressed, laws that are notably expressed in terms of energy. This reality has inherent limits that cannot be exceeded even by improving our technologies. These limits protect life, including human life. The more incompatible a system becomes for human life, for the environment, the closer it gets to collapsing, notably through a lack of the energy needed to power it. The only question is, do we want to let the current societal system collapse because of a lack of energy, in other words, without human control, and thus allow significant human damage to occur during and until its collapse? Or do we want to transform it into a less energy intensive model through concerted action at all levels? Sustainable development, as it is presented in current discourse, is not the solution because it is part and parcel of a profit-based perspective. Thank you.